it's almost like our personalities are our defects that actually create the idiosyncrasies that make us unique, but also, frankly, painfully problematic. And it's when you move beyond that personality, you're actually moving to that place where there's a bit of, there's less of a duality in life, where you're more at one with people. I'm a big believer in two ways of being in life. There's attain and there's attune. And there's times in life when it's better to be one versus the other. But frankly, when you're in the attain mode, you often have to atone afterwards. And when you're in the attune mode, you're at one.
A question asked courageously, answered honestly, and lived authentically can change your whole life. For me, that question was, how can I use what I have, what I love, and what I know to bless the lives of others? The School for Good Living and this podcast are one answer to that question. Hi, I'm Brian Miller. I know that the world can work for everyone, but that it won't until it works for you. I've created this to help you make the difference you were born to make. It's a series of conversations with thought leaders who are moving humanity forward. And in each episode, I explore their lives and the work they do. I also ask them to break down how they've gotten their books written, published, and read. This podcast is all about exploring the magic and mystery, and sometimes the misery, of the creative process. So if you have a mission, a message, and the motivation to share it, this podcast is for you. Welcome to the School for Good Living. Hello, my friends. Today, my guest is Chip Conley, an expert where psychology meets business. Chip is a New York Times bestselling author, and his latest book is Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder. Chip is founder of the Modern Elder Academy, the world's first midlife wisdom school, which you can learn about by visiting modernelderacademy.com. Chip founded Joie de Vivre, which grew to become the world's second largest boutique hotel chain, which he ran for 24 years, grew to 3,500 employees before he sold it in pursuit of freedom and creativity. He has served as strategic advisor to the founders of Airbnb. Chip has served on the boards of the Esalen Academy and Burning Man. He is a festival lover at heart. He has broad experience and incredible wisdom. I was interested to talk to Chip because his latest book really recognizes that we're living longer and looking for meaning in ways that we never have before. Chip makes the point that everyone gets older, but not everyone gets elder. The first just happens if you're lucky and healthy. The other you have to earn. In this conversation, I explore with Chip the rationale behind his thinking, what it means to have a midlife crisis or a midlife awakening. In some ways, it's a choice. Chip shares many useful and interesting insights in this interview, including this: the more digital we get, the more ritual we need. In this conversation, Chip and I explore the topic of retirement. We talk about the three things that happen for many people in retirement that actually cause a decline in the quality of their life, and what we can do to avoid those. Chip talks about something called the U-curve of happiness, pointing out how life satisfaction declines as we approach mid-age, but then it goes back up again. And that is only one of many things that Chip has brought to my attention that I'm really excited about. I am looking forward to getting older, and I'm grateful to next-level thinkers like Chip, who are helping us to not only live longer, but to live better. I think you'll hear many things in this interview that will help you make the rest of your life the best of your life. So thanks for listening. Please enjoy this conversation with my new friend, Chip Conley. Chip, welcome to the School for Good Living.
Great to be with you. I'm honored to join you.
Yes, I'm so glad you have. Chip, will you tell me, please, what's life about?
Well, I guess I would say that I'd quote someone else who once said, the meaning of life is to find your gift and the purpose of life is to give it away. So I think it's really that sequence, the idea of, in many ways, it's the first half of your life, which is the period of time where you really tap into your talents, your wisdom, maybe the gifts that you've been given. And then the second half of your life is to actually explore how you give those away and maybe create a legacy by doing so. So I would say that is what life is all about.
Oh, beautiful. I love that idea. And for me, as I hear you share it now, it brings to mind something I've also heard you say, which is about, for many of us, maybe all of us, the first half of life is about accumulating and the last half is about editing. Will you talk about that?
Yeah, I think it's been interesting. I've studied a lot of thinkers, psychologists, philosophers around what happens in midlife and what's the first half versus the second half versus the second half. And that my idea that it's about accumulation and then it's editing is sort of my own idea around that. But it really comes from the idea that in the first half of life, we're in the exploration mode. And in fact, often we're living someone else's life. It's based upon standards and ways of being that often are defined by our family or our social milieu, whoever we've been surrounded by. And there's a point at which we start to feel the weight of all the baggage of the responsibilities, the mindset, the identities, the people in our life, the children, whatever, all of that stuff, just even the stuff, the physical material stuff. And at that point, we feel almost this sense of being suffocating by it, all of that. And it's at that point, frankly, around midlife, when people often have what's called a midlife crisis. I like to call it a midlife awakening. It is at that point where they start to realize that much of this is baggage. And if you're going to run the midlife marathon, which I think is now will last 40 years, from 35 to 75, you better get rid of some of the baggage, because it's no fun to run a marathon with baggage. And so that's when you start to edit. And the editing process of your life is when you start to determine what's truly important to you. And that's really when wisdom starts to kick in. Wisdom is all about helping you understand what's essential and important in life.
Yeah. I know this is something you've devoted your life to, and I love that your writing and your speaking is really at the intersection of business and psychology, what it means to live well. I love that you take a big picture, long-term view of things. And of course, this includes death. And I know you've had your own flatline experience. And I know in your book, Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder, you share that in a period of about 5 years, you lost 4 friends to suicide. So clearly death is a part of life, but this has reached perhaps an epidemic proportion. But I wonder if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about your own experience with death.
Sure. It snuck up on me, and I'm a hotelier, and I had a hotelier wake up call. Sort of a funny irony. I was 47 years old. This was 12 years ago, and it was at the start of the Great Recession. I was going through a really rough time on many levels. Every part of my life was sort of falling apart. And one of my closest friends named Chip, strangely has the same name as me, who was my insurance broker, but he's also sort of my spiritual guide. He committed suicide. He was the first of the 4 friends that committed suicide during the Great Recession. And it was a strange time, because it was at a time where I was having dreams and nightmares of, death, usually cancer and car crashes. And so I was telling him and others about it, and then he committed suicide. And so that was basically April 30th, 2008. And over the next 2 to 3 months, my life fell apart even worse. And then I broke my ankle playing baseball, got a bacterial infection in my leg from the injury, and ended up on a very strong antibiotic. And I should have actually just stayed at home. I mean, at that point, it was like, okay, maybe at home with the covers over my head.
Yeah, but hindsight is always perfect, right?
Yeah, it is. And I was just sort of I felt like, okay, I don't want this depression that I felt was coming upon me to take over me. And I felt, my natural tendency in life has been to be an attainer and be in action. And if I run fast enough, I will outrun my emotions. And in this case, it was almost, if I run fast enough, I will outrun my death. Because what ended up happening, I was on stage in St. Louis giving a speech. I was then still on stage signing books, and fortunately sitting down, and I went unconscious in my chair when I was signing someone's book. And I got up like 3 to 5 minutes later. Didn't get up. I just became conscious. And then the paramedics showed up soon after that. Once they put me on the gurney, they actually put heart monitors on me. And that's actually when I went flatline. And it was the first of a few times. And it was primarily a very strong allergic reaction to an antibiotic I was on for my septic leg. And so what that did, though, is it really, really acquainted me with this idea of like, wow, life is precious every day. You never know if it's going to be a last. And it led me over the next 2 years, a very difficult 2 years of the Great Recession, to sell my company that I thought I would run till I was 75 years old, but I sold it at age 49 and was just ready to move on. And it was hard because it represented my identity in so many ways. I started the company when I was 26. So I ran it for almost 24 years, but it really woke me up to, what am I looking for in my life now? And the reason I started the company at age 26, it was a boutique hotel company called Joie de Vivre. Ironically, I wasn't feeling a lot of joie de vivre, which means joy of life in French. I realized that I started the company for creativity and freedom. And by the time I had my flatline experience, I had 3,500 employees and just an enormous payroll going into a downturn where we were going to lose a lot of money. And I didn't have the money in the bank. I sold at the exact wrong time to sell from a financial perspective, but I sold at exactly the right time to sell from a good life perspective.
Wow. Yeah. The things, there's so much about that touches me. One of them is the generosity of your heart to wait until the EMTs, the paramedics were there. that was pretty nice. And then also facing death, it sounds like not just physically, but financially, there too. That's pretty incredible, the parallels of that. And I'm sure they impacted, had an effect on one another. But man, that's incredible. And, now with what you're doing, and I'm really encouraged and inspired by the work you're doing, by the way, because I recently turned 40. I'm 42. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, I didn't think I would ever make it to 40. The way I had a pretty grim outlook on life when I was young. I felt, I had a real nihilistic worldview. I didn't think there was such thing as meaning, and not in an empowering way, not like, oh, it's just up to me to bring meaning to life,
Right.
And so I didn't expect to be here, but my 40th birthday was one of the best days of my life. And I'm further encouraged by the fact that I've read you say that your 50s have been your favorite decade so far.
Oh, by far. Yeah. And it's not like I've had a terrible life, but there's a lot of social science that actually backs this up. Let me talk about the U-curve of happiness. So the U-curve of happiness has been studied across virtually all cultures and countries around the world. And what it's shown is similar to what we were talking about earlier. When people hit 45 to 50, I'm sorry to say that, Brian, although I think because you're evolved and accelerated in your life, you may have already gone through it. But generally speaking, there's a point in people's lives where there's a long, slow reduction in life satisfaction or happiness. Starts frankly in people's early to mid 20s, and it tends to actually bottom out around 45 to 50. And then basically there's an equation. I wrote a book called Emotional Equations a few years ago, and there's an equation that defines it, which is disappointment equals expectations minus reality. And it's at that point around 45 to 50 that a lot of people actually shift their expectations. And Brene Brown calls it the midlife unraveling. And what she's talking about there is the idea that you unravel all of the expectations that you've had on yourself and others have had on you. And you actually, for that sake of that equation, disappointment equals expectations minus reality, you actually take down the expectation sum. And in many ways, you actually jettison what isn't serving you anymore. So I think that for me, that is exactly what happened. I went into my 50s feeling quite a bit of creativity and freedom, which was the thing I really was missing. But ironically, was the thing that led me to starting my company. And then my 50s have been a fascinating sojourn on many levels, at a time where, generally speaking, society seems to suggest that you are being put out to pasture and your best days are behind you. There's no doubt my 50s have been my best days on many levels, and certainly from a life contentment perspective.
That is so great. And what I love in hearing what you're sharing now is really what I see is a strong sense of internal congruence, of integrity, where you were willing to look at your life honestly, first of all, which I know not all of us are. In fact, it reminds me of Jung's statement about, maybe misquote this, but about we will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid looking at our own soul. But you were willing to do that, and to see that why you started the company was this desire to experience freedom and creativity, and that to allow that to continue to guide you into the future, even when it was unknown.
Absolutely. Jung was actually a bit of a guide for me during this time, because one of the other things he said, again paraphrasing, was you can't live the afternoon of your life based upon the rules of the morning, because by the time you get to the afternoon, what used to be truth has become a lie. And what he was really speaking to was the idea that, in my opinion, that the first half of your life is from adolescence to what we call now middlescence, which is the emotional and hormonal changes that go on in midlife, which are most famously known for, with menopause for women, but it's also something called andropause for men. Is that era from adolescence to middlescence are almost like those are the bookends of ego.
Mm.
And ego can be a very positive thing in someone's life in the sense that it helps you to individuate. It helps to be a motivator in life. It helps you to feel the sense of who you are potentially. But ego taken to the extreme, or ego lived later in life, can often look sort of sad and ridiculous. And so what happens is what Jung was talking about in terms of the rules of the morning were very ego-driven rules. The rules of the afternoon are very soul-driven rules. And so the primary operating system that defines the first half of your life is your ego. But then there's a shift, and often the shift happens without any language or any roadmap that tells you you're about to have a hair turn, a hair, what do you call it? A hairpin turn.
Hairpin, yeah.
Yeah, you're going to have a hairpin turn here, but nobody tells you. And in that hairpin turn is when you come face to face with your soul, and you have the opportunity to realize that your soul can become your primary operating system. And if you appropriately and successfully make that transition in midlife, life gets so much better, because some of the way you see your life and the way you see yourself, you look at yourself and you say, yeah, those are the rules of the morning. Those are not the rules of the afternoon or the early evening, or as I like to call it, my Indian summer. Which is sort of the era I'm in right now, which is sort of late summer, which is sort of, late 50s is, early 60s is sort of a late summer part of life, not quite into the full autumn season, which might be, your mid 60s to your mid 70s, and then you go into winter, maybe in your 80s, or, if you're lucky enough, maybe your 90s. So I think that recognizing that it's not, sometimes people say, well, the character of a person doesn't change. Yeah, the character may not. The priorities may. The personality may. But there's, I think these are different qualities of a human being.
Yeah.
Certainly the values may. I think character may not change a lot. Values can change dramatically. I think personality can change moderately as well. So.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I've seen that already in my own life. And, now in the coaching work I do, and in some of the teachers that I've had the privilege to study with, in fact, I think about something I heard Sadhguru say that I thought was really amazing when he said, personality is a psychological malady. And I was like, whoa,
wow.
And then talking about how in the same way we have a physical body, we have this mental body that's an accumulation of things, but it's not who we are. So, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but I definitely, like you're saying, believe we can change our personality.
It's interesting. I mean, I think it's like so many things. My habits are not me. My personality is not me. And I think as you get later in life, it's not that you don't have traits and ways of being that define you that are different. I'm a huge fan of the Enneagram, which is a ancient personality typing tool. And I do believe that there's a lot of value in it. But I actually think when you get from the unhealthy side of each of the 9 types of the Enneagram to the healthier type, you start to actually move in a direction where all of them start to merge a little bit. And the most high functioning people in life are people who actually look pretty similar to each other. It's almost like our personalities are our defects that actually create the idiosyncrasies that make us unique, but also, frankly, painfully problematic. And it's when you move beyond that personality, you're actually moving to that place where there's a bit of, there's less of a duality in life, where you're more at one with people. I'm a big believer in, this is my own philosophy on this one, is that I think you can have 2 ways of being in life. There's attain and there's attune. And there's times when in life when it's better to be one versus the other, depending, if you're surfing or doing yoga, you probably should attune. If you're running a 100-yard dash, you probably should attain. And so attain and attune, but frankly, when you're in the attain mode, you often have to atone afterwards. And when you're in the attune mode, you're at one. And I think if striving in life, or striving is the wrong word, but living a life and a good life in such a way that you are trying to spend more of your life in the attunement mode as opposed to the attainment mode. The attainment mode is your first half of your life. The attunement mode is the second half of your life. When you're in the attunement mode, you're in the at one place. And when you're in that one place, you are moving out of your personality and you are part of something that's more collective. And I don't know, that's getting pretty heady. I hope you don't mind.
No, I love it. And I think the people who listen to me, this is their jam. So no, I think it's great. And the Enneagram is one of those things that I've, done a little bit of work about, identified my type. I've had the intention to study it more. I figure at some point it's going to be perfect. Is it something, so maybe this is a segue to, I want to ask about the Modern Elder Academy, because I know that's a huge part of what you're up to now. And the connection there maybe is the Enneagram part of your curriculum there. But before we go to that, I do want to be sure to ask you about this, because I know it's something you're passionate about. I figure it must inform what you're doing these days. But you can tell me, is your love of festivals. Will you talk about that? And I know this has been something near and dear to you for a long time.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, let's go back to my biography a little bit. So okay. I sold my company in 2010, Joie de Vivre Hospitality, which at that point was the second largest boutique hotelier in the U.S.
And again, Chip, you'd run it for 24 years?
24 years.
24 years, 3,500 employees.
3,500 employees. We had created 52 boutique hotels, all of them at that time in California.
Amazing.
And so I thought about what was next for me. And the thing that actually was screaming at me, and it was a weird thing, was festivals. I'd spent a lot of my life going to festivals, although I can't say I was a festival junkie at that point. That was soon to come. But I was on the board of Burning Man, the festival in the desert in Nevada, and I had been going to Burning Man for 20 years and was a really early adopter to that festival and really loved what it represented, loved the 10 principles, et cetera. So I was interested in that. What was intriguing to me after I sold my company was this element of the more digital we get, the more ritual we need. And what I mean by that is that, the IRL experiences in real life and the URL experiences, of course, on the web. And the history of humankind has been IRL. We go and we do festivals. And what was interesting is in the first 10 years of this millennia, so from 2000 to 2010, there was this enormous growth in the digital world. And yet there was this enormous growth in festival culture of all kinds, not just music festivals or transformational festivals, but, religious pilgrimages, film festivals, food festivals, art and cultural festivals. They're all showing double-digit growth. So what was going on in my head is, how do you find the world's best festivals? How do you find festivals that are actually made for you? Is there a matchmaker for you to find the perfect festivals for you? And so that's what I went out to do and created a website called Fest 300 soon after I sold my company. And it was a focus on the 300 best festivals in the world, which that company ultimately merged with a company called Everfest. And for, a couple of years, I was going around the world to all the world's best festivals. One year in particular, I went to 36 festivals in 20 countries.
Wow.
It was amazing. And what I learned from that, and this is right before I joined the three founders of Airbnb, but what I actually learned from that was this element of collective effervescence. So Emil Durkheim is first of all, let's go, a lot of interesting work on collective psychology and sociology was done in the early part of the 20th century. So rites of passage, the whole premise of rites of passage and initiations was studied by a guy named Arnold van Gennep in the early 20th century. Emil Durkheim studied something called collective effervescence. He was a French sociologist who studied religious pilgrimages. And what he saw was that when a group comes together and has a common purpose, what seems to happen is the egos of everybody who's there evaporates. And what comes in its place is communal joy.
Wow.
And so and he called that collective effervescence. So what I started to be intrigued by was, how can we create a world that has more collective effervescence? And right around that time, I was approached by the three founders of Airbnb, who wanted me to join them to help take their little tech startup, which this was more than 7 years ago, take their little tech startup and turn it into a global hospitality brand. And like, I didn't have a clue what they were doing. I was a hospitality person who was sort of like completely out of it about this home sharing trend that was, on the horizon. And long story short is I spent 4 years full time with them, pretty much helping them steer the rocket ship. And then the last 3 years, more than 3 years, as a strategic advisor. And for over 7 years now, I've been the in-house mentor to Brian Chesky, the CEO. That experience, and this brings me to Modern Elder Academy, that experience led me to realize something pretty quickly, which was I was 52 at the time I joined. The average age in the company was 26. Within 3 months after I was there, someone started calling me the modern elder in the company, which I initially hated because I thought they were calling me modern elderly. But there's a big difference between an elder and elderly. Elderly is the last 5 or 10 years of your life, and an elder is just a relative term.
Yeah.
If you're a 52-year-old surrounded by 26-year-olds, you are the elder. And then right around that same time, Brian said to me, Chip, we brought you in for your knowledge, but what we've really gotten from you is your wisdom. And I had never in my life thought about what's the difference between knowledge and wisdom. And so long story short is ultimately during my 4 years of 70 hours a week with them, I started percolating a book in me, which was, Wisdom at Work, the Making of a Modern Elder. So I used the term that they used to describe me to describe a period of people's lives that I think is, a more and more important part of our society, because if we're living longer and power is moving younger, which I think there's a lot of evidence of that in the digital world.
Yeah.
And the world is changing faster. Those three variables have left a lot of people in midlife confused. The suicide rate for midlifers is 50% higher today than it was 20 years ago, et cetera. And that's ultimately what led me to creating the world's first midlife wisdom school called the Modern Elder Academy, which I can talk more about, but I just want to shut up so you can so you can ask a question.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. It's an incredible journey, and I love that you followed. I don't know that you would phrase it this way, but to me, the outside observer, it certainly appears you've taken Campbell's advice to follow your bliss. And found ways to share that with others that's also made a difference for them, including me. I've really enjoyed this Wisdom at Work book and watching your TED Talks, although we haven't met in person yet. And I've learned so much about just how our society has changed. I mean, things that when I look at it, I'm like, oh yeah, that's happened. Things like where you point out that this is the first time in recorded history that we have 5 generations working side by side.
Right.
And I was like, that is incredible. Or the fact that these are conventions we've created like adolescence and retirement in the 20th century. And what you point out too, I love Barbara Waxman's term that you introduced me to of middlescence, and how we look forward to adulthood as kids with excitement, but we don't seem to have that same kind of enthusiasm for elderhood, but we could, right? And you're helping us to even be aware of the possibility and to experience it.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think if we're talking about a long-term phenomena here is the fact that there are a lot of people who are what might be called the young old. At 59, as someone who still surfs, is learning to surf, let's be more clear about that, is still trying to surf, and learning Spanish. I don't believe that our lives get smaller as we get older. I actually think not necessarily sure they get larger. They do get larger in the sense of larger perspective, because it's very clear that I think we can have a bigger, more holistic perspective. One of the things that's very true from brains research is that when you're younger, you're exceptionally good at remembering things quickly and you have quick recall. You also have a very focused brain. As you get older, we all know about the fact that we aren't as good with memory and maybe not as quick. But the thing that a lot of people don't know, that's pretty much now well known in the brain science field, is that our brain gets better at holistic thinking and connecting the dots. We can think and see more broadly and in a larger context. And I think that what that really helps us to do is to sort of see that in your 50s, let's say, or even in your early 60s to mid 60s, you may be in a place where you have a role in a company that is evolving with time. And then and beyond that, I think the idea that there's certain professions that are absolutely well suited for someone who's older. A coach, a teacher, a professor, a writer, a poet, a social activist. I
Yeah.
actually think these are all qualities, maybe even certain kinds of legal professions, certainly philosophers. I mean, there's an element that being able to synthesize things is very valuable. Now, a software engineer, less so. There's no doubt that, and it's not just because, there's so many software languages that have been learned since the time you learned your computer engineering, 30 years ago. But it's also because the brain of a software engineer is better suited for what a software engineer needs, which is focus. So I think trying to understand how do we do something that's been proven, which is how do we create environmental mastery in our lives? So environmental mastery, when I'm talking about that, I'm not talking about ecology or the environment. I'm actually talking about the evidence that shows that as we get older, we get better at understanding where to repot ourselves, both in the career space, but also in terms of where we live and who we live with, etc. We have a better sense of what's the perfect habitat for us to flourish. That is a quality you get better at with time. And so with that, it allows you to understand where and when is the right place to be putting yourself in the right habitat that's just right for you at this particular moment in your life.
It's such a great question. And, I love a phrase you use in this book about same seeds, different soil. And having that ability to understand. And I also really appreciate what you're saying about the differences in the way our minds seem to work when we're young and when we're maybe a little older. And to me, that seems like a really elegant feature, a design feature in the universe, just maybe in the same way that a tree has different parts. The roots perform a very different function from the leaves, but they all function in harmony and benefit from one another. And the same, where there's this, I don't know that it's truly symbiotic, but a beneficial relationship between, these who have this life experience and this age and the younger. And to really celebrate and appreciate those differences and not use them as reasons to divide ourselves in any way. I think that's great.
Well, I think what's interesting is when it comes to the intergenerational side of this, there's so much evidence that an intergenerational potluck is the way we solve big problems in the world, because each generation can bring something else to the table that, maybe another generation can't. And again, these are crass generalizations, as if everybody in a generation has the same qualities. That's not true. We don't. But we just certainly have different life views and different perspectives. And some of them are not generational. They're actually stage of life. So when some people say, baby boomers say, those millennials, they're just so narcissistic. And I was like, yeah, you were too in your 20s.
Yeah.
So I think some of these things are like stage of life issues. Some of them are generational issues. But the thing that's particularly interesting to me is that there's some recent evidence out of Europe that of all of the kinds of diversity and inclusion groups you can have in terms of a team, whether it's gender, race, sexual orientation, or age, the one that shows the greatest positive effect, and they all show a positive effect. Let's start with that. Diversity does matter and actually shows when it's well executed on a team that actually it makes for a better team. But the one that's actually the most effective is age diversity. And why is that? It's because it actually lends itself to more cognitive diversity, because there's more diversity in a group when it's different aged brains than when it's different brains from and social backgrounds from people who are different race, gender, or sexual orientation. So it's an interesting thing, from a problem-solving perspective. From a social perspective, it might be a different perspective, who knows? But actually what the evidence is, it's out of Germany, is that from a problem-solving perspective, age-diverse teams have the most profound effect on effectiveness.
I love that. And I might be dating myself here for some of the younger listeners, but I'll buy that. And I'll use as a basis of my reasoning, Gilligan's Island. I don't know if they would have all got off the island if they'd all been homogenous.
That's a very interesting thought. I like that.
Okay. So let me shift our conversation a bit to, I want to ask you about elderhood, about what it means to you. And let's start there. Will you talk a little bit about this term that maybe some people would experience, like maybe you did, equating elder with elderly, to how is this actually an empowering and potentially exciting concept?
Well, let's start with just the idea that words matter. And there have been words in the past that have been reclaimed by those that actually owned the word, and it had been used as a derogatory word previously. Black was a derogatory word from white racists in the South towards people of color, or what at that time were colored people. And then Malcolm X and others, said black is beautiful in the 60s. And redneck, frankly, was a bad term, as was Yankee. Yankee was a term that the Brits called the colonists, and it was a derogatory term.
I forgot that one.
And more recently, queer. Queer is one that's been
Yes.
reclaimed by the LGBTQ community. And so the idea of reclaiming elder is not unheard of. What's the idea I have on this? Well, it's not just elder, because let's also know that elder of the past has some baggage attached to it. It was usually male patriarchy, where all the power rested with the elders, who frankly weren't all that open to change. And frankly, at that time, we lived in a society where change didn't happen very often. So if you were an elder farmer, you're like the farmer's almanac. You knew seeds, you knew light, you knew seasons. You were someone who you had the wisdom, the land wisdom that you could pass on to younger generations. Well, today, some of that wisdom of the past is really more knowledge than it is wisdom, and it's knowledge that actually is somewhat obsolescent. So the elder of the past was regarded with reverence, but the elder of the modern era, the modern elder, is appreciated for not their reverence but their relevance. And in order to be relevant, you better be as curious as you are wise. And what does that mean? It means that you better be open to evolving and editing what you know and your mindsets and everything else around the idea of being just a beginner's mind in that curiosity state. I had to do that at Airbnb. I was at age 52 joining a tech company for the first time. And true story, I joined that company not even thinking I was joining a tech company. I just hadn't even thought, like, wow, this is going to be a very strange habitat. I don't understand the lingo at all. I don't even understand what's the strategy for a tech company. I understood a lot of things. I'm not dumb, but I just didn't understand a lot of things as well.
I'll bet that was really humbling.
Oh, I had to actually be comfortable being the dumbest person in the room a lot. And yet I was supposed to be the one who they brought in to help them as the knowledgeable person. So I realized that, I had to be curious and wise at the same time. And so this idea that I was relevant allowed me to sort of say, I'm going to be a fast learner on the things I don't know. And then when I see things where I see like, wow, they have a blind spot on something that it had sometimes it had something to do with the industry or my knowledge around leadership or hospitality, but often it had to do with wisdom around humans. The world is full of B2B companies and B2C companies and C2C companies. I don't know. There's all A to Z companies, but really it's all H to H. And H to H basically means human to human. And wisdom often is about pattern recognition of understanding yourself and others. Mm-hmm. And so it's about understanding humans. And so even in a tech company, that human-to-human interaction is essential and pretty important. And in fact, Google studied all of their global teams. They created something called Project Aristotle because what they wanted to do is to understand what's the number one, or actually what it turned out to be the top 5 variables that make for an effective team. And I won't go over numbers 2 through 5, but far and away number 1 was psychological safety. So psychological safety came absolutely down to understanding the team and how do you create an environment where people feel like they can build trust, where people are of varying demographic types that don't fit the dominant in the group. They feel like they have a voice, where people feel like they can have a different opinion and voice it and have a conversation about it and then align around it. All of that made for the most effective teams. And what it was also found was that generally speaking, if you have an age-diverse team, and especially if you have some emotionally moderate older people on the team, because generally speaking, EQ grows with age, it actually makes for a more effective team and more psychological safety. And I found at Airbnb, what that meant for me often was like no one thought of me as competition. The person across the table who was their same age and they were vying for the same career path, that was competition. Yeah. And in that case, it was, everybody was trying to be the smartest person in the room to out compete each other. But when it came to Chip, it was not like I wasn't competing with anybody. And so what that meant, and I was also a little bit more emotionally moderate. So when things would get hairy in a meeting, I was sometimes the one who helped bring it back to a place of being on even keeled.
Yeah, that's so valuable. I remember reading that study that Google created. And I think part of what's so valuable about it is that this isn't just some blogger's opinion, right? I mean, Google is a very analytical company, obviously, and they did a broad study. And I know this is something that I love. You have this, what I would call affectionately, you're a bit of a nerd for papers, scientific, papers and stuff like that. And part
Yes,
of that
I
is,
am.
I think, reflected in the role, one of the roles you also took about being a librarian. Will you talk about
Yeah.
that and how this relates?
Yeah, I had two roles that I like to talk about. I mean, I had many roles. I ultimately, weirdly, about 2 months into the job, Brian said to me, "You're now in charge of strategy for the company. You're the head of global hospitality and strategy." And it's funny, like, Brian, I've never actually been in a tech company. You want me to be the head of strategy for a tech company? That's funny. But one of the things that was interesting, that was at times my role, especially when people would say, "I want you to be my mentor." What a person would, in some cases, what they're asking was, "I want you to actually be my advisor. I
Mm.
want you to be my librarian." And what they really meant was, "I want you to show me the know-who, or give me the know-who and know-how of something that you have some knowledge on." So knowledge speaks. And so they would ask me questions. My job was to sort of like help answer the questions and help them understand that particular thing. And it usually was a very finite relationship. On the other hand, sometimes people would ask me to be a mentor, and they weren't really looking for something finite and specific like knowledge. They were really looking for, like, how can I be a better leader, or what's the right career path, or how can I be more emotionally intelligent? Generally speaking, these are questions that require not just a little bit of advice, but it's an ongoing mentor role, or what I called the confidant role. And actually, I called it the confidant role because one of my direct reports said to me, she was French, and she said, "Chip, you're my confidant." And this was about 2 months into me leading her, managing her. And I looked at her and I said, "You haven't told me anything juicy yet. How am I your confidant?" And she said, "No, in my part of France, when someone calls you a confidant, they're not saying, you're the person who you give all the secrets to. You're actually saying, you're the one who gives me confidence. You're the one who actually makes me feel confident and makes good choices and
Wow.
helps me to see what are the things I need to know in order to make the right choices. You're my permissionary. You give me the permission, but you also give me the tools of how to get it right
What a
to be
compliment.
successful." And so, yes, so when someone told me I was a confidant, it really meant, I want to have an ongoing relationship with you where wisdom listens. So it's interesting. Jimi Hendrix long ago said, "Knowledge speaks and wisdom listens." The first relationship, being the librarian, knowledge speaks. They ask me questions, I answer them. I'm speaking. The second kind of relationship, where they really wanted almost personal development, my relationship was not to speak knowledge. My relationship was to listen
Mm.
with wisdom. And wisdom listens basically in that case meant, often what I would do is I was the one asking them questions,
Mm.
and using something called appreciative inquiry, which is a really interesting form of how to be more curious and catalytic with your questions, that opens up possibilities. And so what I often would help people find the right answer. And by the fact that we found it together, or they found it by themselves, but I helped lead them there, meant that they were more committed to it. And they were able to see the logic of how they got there, as opposed to just Chip went and just gave them the answer.
Yeah.
And so that was a fascinating journey to learn all of that and to sort of be my own teacher. But what was so interesting about this, Brian, was like I didn't really have any guidance on this stuff. I mean,
It's kind of ironic that here you are
yeah,
providing wisdom and guidance without
I
it
was
on
looking
yourself.
for it, and there's this guy Bill Campbell who's passed away, but he was like quite famous in Silicon Valley, as they called him, the coach, and he was somebody who gave lots and lots of wisdom and advice to Steve Jobs and the founders of Google and a lot of people. So I started reading up on him a little bit, and I actually tried to reach out to him just before he died, and unfortunately we never connected. But I almost was channeling Bill Campbell, and what that led me to was this idea, okay, I got to write a book about this. And so I came down here to Baja, which is where I had just bought a home and renovated it. And so I'm 1 hour north of Cabo San Lucas on the Pacific Ocean side, in an area called Todos Santos, and our little village, fishing and farming village, is called El Pescadero. And so I started writing this book. And when I was writing the book, what happened was this light bulb, I got kissed by Epiphany as if she was some angel, when I was going for a run on the beach. I came back from a beach run and I just said, wow, I have been a hospitality leader for virtually my whole career. I have been on the board of the Esalen Institute for almost 10 years, and I've been a teacher there for many years, which is, the first personal growth retreat center. So I understand that world. And then I've spent the last few years at Airbnb, and I have a new point of view on how to create a new mindset on aging and how to become a modern elder. What if we created the world's first midlife wisdom school? Because, back to something we talked about earlier, adolescence as a life stage, it has only a 116-year career. It was created in 1904. The word was coined and the concept was created. And prior to that point, very, very few people in the United States went to public junior or senior high school. And then adolescence came along and said, well, adolescence is a life stage. It's sort of an interstitial, liminal stage, a transitional stage between childhood and adulthood. We need to help give people schools and tools to help them with that period of time to prepare them for this next stage of life called adulthood. And guess what? Adolescence, the founding of adolescence led to that. Well, the founding of middlescence is relatively new. And I actually think middlescence is what prepares you for elderhood. And again, not elderly, but elderhood. And so we need schools and tools to help people with this era, especially at a time where, frankly, power is moving younger and more people are feeling irrelevant and lost and sometimes, moving to suicide. And that's the origin story for why, almost 3 years ago, I first had the concept. And then January of 2018, we opened with a half year of beta groups, trying it out, 13 different cohorts. And then we opened to the public in November 2018.
Wow.
And have now had 800 people from 24 countries go through the either 1 week or 2 week programs that we offer.
That is so fantastic. And your story of going down there, buying the home, renovating, having the epiphany with the run on the beach, it just sounds so magical or divinely inspired. Hey, thanks so much for listening to part 1 of my interview with Chip Conley. Please tune in to part 2 as we continue our conversation. Despite living in an age where we have more comforts and conveniences than ever before, life isn't working for many people. Whether it's in the developed world, where we're dealing with depression, anxiety, addiction, divorce, jobs we hate, relationships that don't work, or people in the developing world who don't have access to clean water or sanitation or healthcare or education, or who live in conflict zones. There's a lot of people on the planet that life isn't working very well for. If you're one of those people, I invite you to connect with me at goodliving.com. I've created Life's Best Practices Breakthrough Coaching to help you navigate the transitions that we all go through. Whether you've just graduated school, you're going through a divorce, you just got married, you're headed into retirement, you're starting a business, you just lost your job, whatever it is you're facing, I've developed a 36-week course that you go through with me and a community of achievers and seekers who are committed to improving their own lives and the lives of others. So through this online program, you will have the opportunity to go deep into every area of your life, explore life's big questions, create answers for yourself in community, get clarity and accountability. If that's something you're interested to learn about, I invite you to contact me directly at brian@brianmiller.com or by visiting goodliving.com.